last month, I saw this video from Spilo. It was popping off, and a bunch of people recommended it to me and told me to react to it. I didn't want to watch it at the time because it was kind of popping and I didn't want to take away from it. I wanted to like give it a little time. Then 66 stuff kind of, rolled off a little bit. And then this week we had the announcement of the 66 trials. And so I DM'd Spilo and was like, hey, you mind if I watch this now? And he was like, yeah, sure. You can go for it, dude. I wanted to watch this back at the time, and now I get to. I tested 6v6 Overwatch to prove everyone wrong. So I'm assuming, because if I remember correctly, Spilo was more on the 5v5 over 6v6 stuff. So I'm curious. All right, let's roll.
I played, tested, studied, strategized, analyzed, and theorized 6v6 for 25 hours.
Yeah, I saw that one too. I roasted Tim the Tapman to teach you hit scan TPS for Tim. Yeah, I saw it.
Weeks, utilizing 2 different versions of the 6v6 workshop code, playing both main tank, off tank, damage, and support, all while playing and spectating lobbies from Platinum to Grandmaster. Today I'm going to be sharing everything you need to know and prepare for with Overwatch's upcoming 6v6 experiment.
I'm actually excited for the
my name is Spilo.
6v6
I'm a professional
experiment.
Overwatch coach with over 10,000 hours of private coaching experience. All heroes, all roles. But more than that, I'm also someone who's coached in the esports scenes at both the content.
I was just thinking to myself, why is he giving an introduction? Because I've known him for so long, and I realized probably not everyone knows him. Yeah, so I've been doing coaching stuff forever. Actually, you want to know something really funny? Hang on, I'm not going to show you our DMs, but I will read something to you. April of 2019, Spilo DMs me, and he goes, "Hey mate, just saw your Lucio VOD review on Reddit. Solid stuff. Nice to see folks that are really good at VOD reviews putting content out there. Keep up the good work." And I said, hey, thanks for the kind words. Means a lot. I'll definitely try to keep meeting your expectations. And then he DM'd me again in September of 2019. Said, hey, going through your Widow VOD reviews. Good stuff. Appreciate the work. And then he said, LOL, wait, you're the same dude. Nice. After that, he started coaching Uprising contenders. Guess who used to work for Uprising? So I met him through that. Because he would come to the facility. He drove from like New Hampshire. He would drive like 2+ hours a day to work through Boston. So like realistically, maybe even closer to 3 every day, both ways, to go down and coach for like poverty wages. So the guy gives a shit, and he's good at what he does.
And the Overwatch League level for 5 years. 3 of those coaching double shield, goats, dive comps, and every variation of 6v6 composition that's ever been meta. Point being, I know the game.
Uphill in the snow. Okay, it's Boston in the winter. Of course it's uphill in the snow.
It's theory in both the 5v5 and 6v6 format from both the bronze level to the professional. One disclaimer I do need to get out of the way is that while the developers of the workshop codes I used did a phenomenal job putting it all together, in fact, I interviewed them, you can check that out here, it's not Blizzard endorsed officially. It's simply our best guess at how 66 may look in the future test.
This is why I didn't really want to play it that much, especially after like the announcements came of like, we want to try it. I was like, oh yeah, now I have no desire to play the community crafted one, which granted is fine. Like I think it's cool that they did it, and it was good that they made it. Like it's a passion project clearly. But I'd rather play like the actual, like their best foot forward, because at that point I can give it the best, what would be the word for it? Not opinion maybe, but like best, like it would give it its best shot.
The good news is that while the details and hero viabilities may change between now and then, the theory that we're going to be talking about today will not. Before we talk about 6v6, let's talk briefly about why Overwatch went to 5v5 in the first place and why it's considering going back. First off was Sustain Watch. Overwatch had a series of really unfortunate metas, whether it was Double Shield and a lot of other metas that just basically...
This corner has brought me so much pain and suffering. This corner right here. I could tell you from Overwatch literal memory everything that's happening in this room. There's a BAP in there. There's a Sigma, an Orisa, probably a Brig, and then depending on what meta it is, it's probably a Mei and a Bastion.
Series of really unfortunate metas, whether it was Double Shield and a lot of other metas that just basically revolved
or the
around
Mei Doom,
space, not taking angles.
Oh my god! Oh, this one was the Reaper Doom.
Support and DPS hero categories, with the goal of just going towards moving into big clumps, denying off angles, sustain shields, more healing, and more healing. This was a big issue because a lot of hero design and balance issues were not addressed back in Overwatch 1. You see, say what you will about Overwatch 2, but the design and balance philosophy happens at a much more rapid rate. Back in Overwatch 1, we
Agreed.
often had months and months with broken metas and no patch changes. And
this is why I always say, even if I disagree with their balance sometimes, and I think it's sometimes really bad, and some certain patches end up being really bad, it doesn't stay that way for very long, so I'll always give them the benefit of the doubt.
Finally, when the patch did come through with some
because I was there when this shit was happening. So many were not there. You know, if something is bad for like 2 weeks to a month, and I'm like, okay, this shit's bad, fix it. Then they fix it. I'm like, good, thank you, like good change. And then I give them a little applause. They're like, you shell, why are you applauding them? It's like, because they changed it, you dumb. Back in the day, that'd be 8 months before a change.
Tiny little number tweak to healing. I mean, come on.
The Overwatch team has faced some criticism for being a little bit slow when it comes to our balance patches.
There you go! Like, Jesus Christ, man, it's right. Holy like, people do not know how long it lasted. So December 2018, August 2018, January 9, 2019. I might be in the way of really quick. August 2019, February 2020, October 2020, November 2020.
This is also after the release of original Shield Orisa, Sigma, Baptiste, Brig, and Moira, all characters that contribute to the sustain watch, group up, just tank it out, and just basically out healing any sort of pressure. Notoriously a meta that was very unfriendly to a lot of the dive, more fun, and more popular characters like Reinhardt, Genji, Winston, Ana, and so on. Now, this was not necessarily a 6v6 issue. As we're going to talk about in a little bit here, there's
Pepperidge Farm remembers the ball hog meta towards the end of Overwatch 1. Brig Zen, ball hog. Oh. Or Brig Zen, hog Sigma. Hog Sigma. Ooh.
So a lot of ways in 6v6 could have functioned without this and done just fine. The problem was that a lot of the hero designs and balance done at that time was really, really bad. Regardless of whether this was a major factor in going to 5v5, I definitely think it was a minor factor because it was certainly a factor that moved us into role queue. Next up,
the only worst meta ever was Hog Zarya. Hog Zarya was the worst meta in the history of Overwatch. That shit was horrendous.
Vigil impact through space, because this is something that when we're going into a first-person shooter that's going free to play, is people need to have a little bit, or need to feel like they have a little bit more individual play.
Board bubbles.
Succeed with that is
I'd get bored and bubbly
one thing
too
for
early.
certain is that one player technically does have more impact on the battlefield in Overwatch 2 now. Finally, and maybe most importantly, were queue times. Now, I'm not going to go into details here. There's a great developer blog post on this. But basically, queue times for tank were a big bottleneck. Partly because tank is just not the most popular role in any game, period. And secondly, because tank was plagued with a lot of really crappy, unpopular hero designs. Sigma's done better since Overwatch 2, but Sigma in Overwatch 1, Orisa in Overwatch 1, and a lot of the other tanks that were meta in Overwatch 1, it just wasn't a very fun role to play. So not only were tank players not very common, but tank was plagued with a lot of heroes that people just didn't want to be forced to play. So the question is, after all that, why are we reconsidering 6v6?
Don't forget the hog players. Don't forget the flex queue ticketers. Oh my god, there's so many people who probably don't know about flex queue tickets. So back in the day, they inputted this system that you could get a ticket. If you flex queued and you won a game, you get like 3 tickets. If you lost the game, you get 1 ticket. And each ticket would give you a faster queue time. Like it would give you like a priority queue. So people would have to flex queue, and the flex queue was AKA tank queue. And so DPS players who had 15, 20-minute long queues would flex queue, get a 2-minute tank game, flex to hog, play hog for 5 minutes, get rolled or roll, and then get a couple tickets. And so you'd every once in a while bump into a DPS hog player every few games, and it was ass.
First off, let's talk about the philosophy about why 5v5 is issues. Number one is the solo tank problem, of where when you only have one person taking the attention, taking space, baiting attention, you can feel a little bit like a human punching bag. And with 2 tanks, yes, you were a lot squishier, but at least you had the opportunity to have somebody else split the attention with you. In addition to that, a lot of the design philosophy around solo tank has leaned more into the raid boss style of things, instead of having basically a slightly tankier DPS. And so what we have are these giga raid boss tanks that feel almost impossible to do anything to, and they can definitely introduce a lot of pain points into gameplay. I will say that it doesn't necessarily mean that tank is always the most impactful role. It often is, but Gavin Winter has elaborated that at least at the higher ranks, the convergence of which role contributes the most to winning a game is actually really close. And so that's good news from a balance perspective, but it doesn't necessarily.
I have like a semi-hot take on that. I feel like low-key it's the DPS players who bitch the most. Like they always say like their role is unplayable or whatever is bad, and it's like for very brief periods of time. It's like hit scan players playing in a diva. Yeah, no shit. The diva's got 3 seconds of defense majors gone. Of course you can't play the game for a little bit. Like that's what happens. But like 90% of the time, they're actually fine, and they actually have insane amounts of impact. Did everyone just conveniently forget the Sojourn Mercies dominating the first 2 seasons of the game? or the widows right now. Did we just conveniently forget those eras, right? It's like when one tank ends up being strong, like really strong, it's like, oh my god, my role is useless. No, it's not. Like if there's a major tank diff, yeah, sure, but that's because like one, there's a major tank diff, and two, your tank player's getting shit on. Their tank player's really good. They're earning their win right now. Like you could still beat them. You'd probably just have to counter swap them out of the marbles. But like, do you want to do that? No, you just want to play Tracer. Like, so it's like, I don't know. And then I feel like they blame the support players. You know, like I feel like the DPS players have always blamed support players and say their role's so easy and all this other stuff too. And it's like, oh man, like it's kind of meme at this point. It's not really that serious anymore. But there was an era where it was serious.
Make the game more fun to play. In addition to that, obviously with the announcement of solo tank, a lot of off-tank players, people that used to play D.Va, Zarya, and so on back in Overwatch 1, were rightfully concerned. And that's definitely been a big loss of the 5v5, is losing the off-tank identity of many of those characters and the tank synergy that so many people enjoy. In addition to that, the variety of tank combos is obviously just completely gone. One of the nice things about having two tanks is that introducing a new character into the hero pool is that you're going to have multiple different ways of comboing that character with all of the tanks. But when a new tank is introduced, you're just going to play it and nothing else. Can make the game feel a little bit more samey because instead of adding this new tank in combination with all the other tanks, it's just a new tank by itself. Finally, perhaps we have a little bit more confidence in our balance team to make aggressive changes as necessary for 6v6. You see, part of the reason why people have such a negative opinion of 6v6 is, that, as I said earlier, the design and balance of many of the characters at the time. Nowadays, while things can still be pretty ugly, at least there's quick adjustments and things they're willing to try and dial back if it doesn't work.
But Q times.
I don't think we would have had double.
I feel like I mean, at least when I personally look back, I always think like, yeah, like balance is really shit, but it's fixable. Like I think today's balance team would do much better with it, but it's Q times.
Shield with the current Overwatch 2 balance team for as long as we did. So how did we actually try 6v6? And this is where the workshop comes into play here. The workshop is a tool developed in Overwatch 1 that allows people to make up their own custom games and really to get quite complicated with it. What the workshop developers attempted to do is bring back
Q times is the only legitimate argument.
Well,
Q times is the most legitimate argument. If people don't play the game or can't get into the game, it doesn't matter how good it is because people won't play it.
To try it. It wasn't really a competition.
So like, even if you say it's the only argument, it is the most substantial argument in the room.
With the current developers of Overwatch 2, so much as an opportunity to go back and play the game the way that you remembered it. My adjustments that I made to this was to introduce the Season 9 projectile and health changes that I feel will not be reverted. You see, one of the limitations of the workshop code is that with the increase of projectile sizes in Season 9, they were not able to revert those. So while they had the original health pools of Overwatch 1, all the projectiles were easier, so it basically meant everyone was getting two-shot. Didn't feel that was a very honest testing ground for what Overwatch 2 is likely to have in the future. So what I did is I had post-Season 9 health pools, post-Season 9 projectile sizes, and give that as our testing environment for today. So overall, we're going to be looking at the good and the bad.
Yeah, that's
smart. No matter the format, there will be upsides and downsides. So please draw your own conclusions from your own testing and also reserve final judgment, of course, until you finally actually test the 6v6 thing, because this is just our best guess. Immediately.
Yeah, true. That's the whole reason why I didn't end up doing it, is because I didn't want to have like any skewed view from this.
Upon testing, I noticed that
which now we know we're going to get a chance to next season.
Weaker. Orisa's rework, the mobility creep of some of the cast, the weaker position of some of the sustain/poke heroes like Baptiste, Brig, and Hanzo, especially in the code, made it feel nearly impossible to just turtle and sustain. And we tried. We tried the best variation of double shield. We tried running Bat Brig, and a lot of those combinations just didn't really work that well. On the code that we played, and what feels like the direction of Overwatch 2 in general, is that mobility and higher skill heroes felt a little bit more dominant. This was good because it shows that while the Overwatch 2 development team has had its hiccups, overall the game has moved a little bit away from the teeth-grindingly slow sustain aspects of Overwatch 1, even if you do bring back 6v6.
That's a good sign, actually.
And this means that one of the big arguments against 6v6 may not be near as much of a problem as people think. The bad news? Well, ignoring the Q times issue, which may be improved with making more appealing tank design, two specific problems stood out, and we're going to go into these in very thorough detail. Number one, the space problem. Space is just generally more contested in 6v6 with or without double shields, often limiting solo capability to retake that space. Some of this is a stylistic choice, however. Number two is the hero problem. 6v6 did not seem to solve many of the tank hero design problems.
See, this is like some Schrodinger's ball sack type shit right here, where it's like, people love to have impact in their own game, and they like hate team play, but they love team play. Like they want to play team-based shooter games or team-based hero games because they want to play together and they want to have synergy, and that's why they loved Overwatch 2, Overwatch 1. You know, they play together, they pop off, they go together. You know, you bubble your rye, and you know everybody plays together as a team, and everyone swaps and plays together. But then reality hits, and that doesn't actually happen. And so they're like, well, then I want to have more impact on a solo game because my Moira is literally butt chugging a water in the corner. I don't know what's going on over there. Like I don't think that guy is literally playing the game. Like I need someone else. I need to be able to kill everyone on my own. But it's like, well, you wanted a team-based game, so you're gonna need to work together with that Moira. You know what I mean? So it's like it's like a catch-22 at all times, where it's like you're never gonna be able to get both. Where like you'll have some people that want more team play, and then there will be some people that want more solo carry potential, and like the same people who want the opposite will always then end up saying the opposite. Like they'll say they want more solo potential, but then they want team play. But then they say they want team play, but then they have bad team play, so they want solo potential. And it's like nobody ever wins in it. So it's like you should just pick one and stick with it. And it's like, how do you do that? I don't know.
Even with some of the balancing efforts done by the 66 developers. We're going to elaborate deeply on both of these points because both are extremely important to fixing 66 in the future. First off, let's talk about the space problem. Many of the 66 fears comes from bad memories of being held hostage in a 2CP choke with double shield. The good news is that while space was an issue, it was less of an issue than I expected, partly due to the reduction of sustain watch, what we talked about earlier, but it's also because map design in Overwatch 2 has evolved for the better. That being said, even without as bad chokes, there's still clear increase in defender's advantage in 66, as a tank setup plus proximity, being able to close the distance, is still a major factor in control.
Wait, this came out before the new season, right? What was the official date? October 2nd? The new season started what, on like the 5th or something? So this was before the map reworks fully came out.
Let me demonstrate. So
maybe the map reworks help?
Havana first defense here. Essentially, you have two tanks split on either side of the choke. In Overwatch 2, with 5v5, there's more space for the enemy team to rotate around right side to attack the high ground, and it's a little bit harder for the enemy team to control that space. If there's anybody controlling that space, it's
like 15
DPS or support, which is a little bit easier to clear out at that proximity.
Point still
However,
stands.
if you replace that DPS with a tank, that tank it's very difficult to clear out because to get a sightline to poke that tank out, you risk running into the enemy tank or the enemy DPS.
Well, the tank,
and to close the distance to
quote
unquote brawl that tank out, well, that's just a lot harder to do to a tank than it is to a DPS or support. Anytime there's any sort of choke where a tank can basically play around a corner, contest space, close the sight lines, it can feel a little bit harder to retake space in 66.
True.
And I found this to be the case on a lot of maps, Kings Row, Flashpoint, and so on. Although interestingly enough, on
I think Kings Row 3rd is dog shit these days because it's one tank. Like Kings Row I think Kings Row should be like the indicator that like something's up sometimes. As the game has gotten on further and further, like I feel like it went from the best map of all time and everyone like unanimously agreed, with some outliers of course, to like now it's absolutely debatable.
Flashpoint, just because of how broad the maps were, 66 felt a lot less congested. You see, the problem here is that a lot of people like to push out this narrative, which is definitely true to extent, that in 66 it's easier to poke out the tank because you have less HP. But the problem with that is that's not always possible with Defender's advantage. You see, tanks in Overwatch 2, largely as a whole, are all stronger up close. Now, they're not necessarily stronger up close to each other, but they're definitely stronger up close to squishies. For example, Sigma is largely seen as a poke tank, but if you get up close to Sigma as a squishy, that's a really, really bad matchup for 99% of the cast. And so the problem with that is that anytime that you have any corners, choke points, where there are multiple lines of attack, it can be very
Who's that, Kelly?
easy as defending tanks in 66 to choke out all those sight lines and force you to close the distance onto the tank to create space. It's not so easy to just simply take an angle and poke out the tank and a lot of these choke points. And while if you do get the opportunity to do that, it's very effective. If you don't, you're really relying off of your tank to take the space for you.
I love the background.
The importance of
music. It's
mobility
kind of
range to open up different angles cannot be understated. Many of the times where I felt choked out, it's because that I was playing a DPS character or a support character that didn't have the mobility to choose all the angles that I wanted to. And that definitely left some DPS, some supports feeling really good in the tank trades and some feeling really bad. Elaborating on this is partly why hit scan was such a hit or miss, no pun intended, in this exact same game mode. When I had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, or when we had Defender's Advantage as a hit scan, it felt very oppressive because to get to the hit scan, you had to kind of crank through two angles that tanks were holding in close range. But attacking as a hit scan when you didn't have space could feel very miserable because closing the distance with most hit scan characters just isn't really a good option, even if the tanks are a little bit squishier. So finding angles and sightlines felt a lot more difficult. I found
So it just kind of means like, we kind of learned this in Overwatch 1, where like stylistically you didn't really want to flank very much. Like it was actually rare that you would go for like really long flanks. It'd be very risky. It was much better to play together. Like that's the whole point. Like Dive was all moving together. Goats was moving all in together. Double Shield was hunkering together, right?
Binary impact of hit scan, sometimes oppressive in defense, sometimes underwhelming on attack.
So I guess if you like flanking a lot, 6v6 is probably not going to be great for you. If you don't like flanking or dealing with flankers, it would be good for you.
It would be a very difficult problem to solve with 6v6, especially with characters like Widowmaker, who went from being completely worthless in some situations in our testing to being absolutely untouchable. You are very reliant on your tanks to create space. So this is again where the 6v6 versus 5v5 preference is. Do you prefer the more team coordination of taking space with your tanks, or do you prefer the individual opportunity or the individual impact of 5v5? It's why Overwatch 2 feels more deathmatchy. Not that there's necessarily less strategy, there's just more space. So there's more individual opportunity to take and hold space appropriately. It's more.
I feel like all of that though can be changed with like map sizes. You know, like you could even make Overwatch 2 more compact with like map design, probably,
democratic,
right?
And there's no real guaranteed safety really in any position that you're holding, because there's always another angle the enemy team could take. In addition to that, I want to point out there's also a serious hero design discrepancy at taking different types of space. You see, a lot of the ugly stepchildren of hero design, like Malga, Roadhog, really struggle taking space when they could just constantly get poked out. You're very reliant on your tank tree to take space, so if you don't necessarily have the right tank combo to break the choke, then you might have a bad time, even though those chokes are better. The big difference is there's more individual autonomy in 5v5, but also one bad apple can ruin the bunch a lot easier. Do you find the tank trade / complexity of using CDs on the enemy tanks with your tanks to scratch your competitive itch? Tank players especially like this, and for good reason. It's a lot of fun. Or do you like the complexity responsibility of reading the situation and the space available to you as a DPS or support player? Overwatch 2 has more options in that category. On the flip side, Overwatch 1 has objectively more immediate complexity on the tank trades, where Overwatch 2 has objectively more immediate complexity in positioning and controlling space. As often by the time we're conceding the control of the space outside the tank trade, the fight may already be decided. For example, if I were to take a Route 66 attack with double bubble Winston Zarya trade, my Winston Zarya might need to try to look for a favorable angle on the enemy tank, try to set up a DPS angle at the same time, and then off of that trade, look for the opportunity to stage for backline as a final result. Whereas in 5v5, you can more immediately set up your DPS on the high ground, the left side, the low ground on the right side, and look for a trade off of your Winston dive. This makes things.
So to make it a little bit less complicated, because I don't think he meant to make it this complicated, but it is this complicated. In Overwatch 1, you would typically have one tank lurking up here, and the other tank lurking in the corner, or lurking on the high ground behind him, right? And so the point of that was, you actually see me do it sometimes. You see me play this map. I play this map so strangely compared to most people, because I actually start up here 90% of the time, and most people don't. And the reason you start up here is because you could deny the space up top, which would mean the other tank would have to come force you out. In 5v5, in Overwatch 1, like a lot of the tank players do not go height here. Like especially, they always go straight. They walk with the cart and then they turn the corner here. I can end up controlling them for free for quite a while. But in Overwatch 1, you'd have one here and one here. So like both tanks would have to clear top. And then once they clear top, then they can clear main. And then once they clear main, then they can engage, right? In Overwatch 2, like if there's nobody contesting here, the enemy DPS just walks up and takes this spot. And then they're automatically in a good position, right? What he's saying is 100% true, just a little bit more complicated.
5, you can more immediately set up your DPS on the high ground, the left side.
Don't sup-unk me, okay? I just been around a long time. It's not an age thing. It's not old. It's just the game's been out a long time, and I've been here.
Side, and look for a trade off of your Winston dive. This makes things a little bit more creative for your DPS, but definitely limits your tank options. So how does this affect DPS players? Well, there's more targets to shoot, but the choices and practice are generally not always super available. You can put a lot more pressure as a DPS character onto tanks now than you were before, but you might not always have the positions that you'd like to actually shoot what you'd like to shoot. So there's more options if you can get the space, but you probably won't always get that exact same space. However, for certain characters that have more mobility, I found this to be a little bit less of an issue. We'll talk more about that later. Supports, there's just more responsibility to heal. There's now 2 tanks to heal, even if the health pools are a little bit smaller, so you're going to be doing more of that. And also there's a little bit worse individual matchup versus poking a tank. Now, that definitely got better in 66, but unfortunately, a lot of support characters just don't do great versus tanks in damage, with the exception of maybe like Zen or Bap. So even though tanks are a little bit squishy, that's not really going to change how you position all that much compared to damage characters that just generally burn tanks better. This means that support with positioning is generally impacted a lot more in terms of not being able to take proactive angles near as much. You remember early Overwatch 2 where every support player was crying that they were dying off of cooldown? Well, that was part of the adjustment required for support players to be a lot more proactive and a lot more duel-oriented. Going back to 6v6, we'll be dialing this back.
Will he do a 7v7 test run? How am I supposed to do a 7v7 test run? The engine doesn't even work.
In the opposite direction. Not a bad thing, but again,
how am I supposed to do that?
I found support skill expression to be diminished slightly, tank to increase slightly, and DPS feels about the same, just different. Finally, some heroes are going to leave you feeling gatekept in terms of taking space, just like it did back in Overwatch 1. Off of that, let's segue into hero design problems. Let's talk about the good first. Some heroes felt pretty darn good from our testing. Doomfist, Junker Queen, and individual hero tweaks like Rhine Pin Cancel all function really nicely in the new environment. Oh, and both enabler tanks, Zarya and D.Va, felt great again, as their original identity has been restored. The bad, well, Malga had his moments, but felt demanding of the right tank combo to function. Turns out self-heal on the enemy tank isn't such a great design. Ramatra felt sluggish.
Who would have seen that coming?
And survival focused, and his long but overly impactful CD cycle left him with massive windows of vulnerability, like a Winston bubble but without the mobility of Monkey. Orisa lacks all identity besides focus tank in Overwatch 2, and so therefore that carries over to Overwatch 1, but that's now much worse as she benefits less from other tanks supporting her, and she doesn't really support the other tanks either. And then Roadhog, well, he's just awful in every single way. Turns out that while some heroes definitely feel better in the 6v6 format, notably off tanks, some heroes don't. Turns out a bad apple is still a bad apple, and a different, even better format doesn't change that. My experience with playing versus some of the bad apples mentioned before was a funny balance of being amused at how inconsistent and awkward they were compared to the voluptuous tank combos of Winston, Ryan, Zarya, Doomfist, D.Va, Ball, and Junker Queen, and how annoyed it made me when we had one of the—
But Junker Queen, very interesting, said Junker Queen, because I feel like Junker Queen was one of those heroes that everybody unanimously agreed when it came out. Great design, very fun, makes a lot of sense, good hero. Pretty unanimously across the board, everyone said or thought that, right? So it's like, interesting. Community's reaction to some of these heroes ends up being pretty spot on in the long run, right?
Those heroes in my team, especially when we didn't have space. You see, that's probably the biggest consistent theme between
Ram being bad though. Ram being bad though is not a huge surprise. Ram does not have the ability to always be doing one thing, right? Like he has to either poke or has to be up close, right? If you play Rhine, you always want to be up close. If you're playing Orisa, old Orisa, let's not say new Orisa, old Orisa, you'd always want to be poking and kind of further away and stacking shields. Playing Sigma, you always want to be in the mid-range, right? Like Ram doing both makes sense for Overwatch 2 because you do both in there's no reason to not do both, right? Like, because like some parts are poking, some parts are brawling. Even when like you're playing a brawl meta, like the positioning, walking up and whatnot. So it's useful for both. But that being said, though, like if you're playing a hyper brawl meta and he runs out of his punches, he's kind of useless, right? It's like an 8-second window, and because sustain is much higher in 6v6, that window becomes much more punishing because the fight doesn't typically last longer than 20 seconds in Overwatch 2. In Overwatch 1, fights could go a full minute.
Orisa, Malga, and to an extent Ramatra. They all either have glaring weaknesses in their defensive capabilities, usually reliance on sustain or just survival, are tank buster focused, something that's a lot more awkward in the double tank format, or severely lacking consistent mobility or range. Pre-rework Orisa Roadhog were horrible to play versus in Overwatch 1, but they function a little bit better due to one reason. They had ways to contribute outside of the tank trade, with also more team utility to contribute as well. Orisa's shield, hull, range pressure, and bongo were all phenomenal tools to pressure and create space from range. Not in a good way for balance necessarily, but in an impactful way. And for Roadhog, ironically, the rework made him worse, because he lost nearly all neutral pressure with the rework to his weapon and his alternate fire. It's either close range take pressure, hook, and that's about it. You can flank, but if the map doesn't provide those options, or you get poked out, you're cooked.
I remember my reaction was I didn't like that they merged the left click and the right click into one, and some people were like, you're overreacting, it's not bad at all because the pellet's in the middle. Now that it's been a while, do you guys still feel the same way? I feel like I liked the left click, right click better than I liked the all-in-one.
Even newer kids in the block like Ramatra and Malga were a bit awkward. Mal was very reliant off of Zarya or another dive tank to enable a lot of his all-in slam cardiac cycles, while being denied by 2 forms of tank mitigation to get his self-heal rolling. And Ramadracidias are so long and his Omnic form poke so bad at range, they often ended up in just take aggro because bullying the solo tank doesn't work so well anymore. Tanks that demand support without providing consistent utility in return, they don't do well. Maybe there's a synergy in here that could make these heroes work, but we weren't able to solve them with the short period of time that we tried. The point remains, whether weak, dull, or frustrating to play with or against, these heroes are still flops in my eyes on the hero cast. And whether 5v5 or 66, much is needed to match the create.
Say it with me. Carissa. Cog. Malga.
Complexity, and dynamics of the other tanks in the cast. Now we're gonna get into some feedback here. The last day of Pugs that we did, we spent around 4 or 5 hours playing with only high elo players, masters, GM, and so on. And we wanted to try to create a more environment where people were more communicating, trying to play optimal tank strategies, and just...
I don't know why, but my brain is so fried at this point. When I heard high elo, I just was like, high elo gamers only, gold 3 and above,
trying different
2300.
I got some feedback from all these players that I want to share with you guys here, which will echo some of my points.
Keep the chat to high gamers, high elo gamers only.
Number 1, let's talk about tanks. Tank felt more limited, but didn't necessarily feel worse. Another player says tank combos heavily affected their enjoyment. Very, very high highs, very low lows, depending on their partner.
Yep.
In addition to that, the good news, though, is that when the combo worked, the attention split from the other tank was definitely noticeable when coordinated or had the right combo.
Yep.
And this is great. In the 5v5 environment, one of the big problems is that
all
the attention is being put on you. Well, this player says if you get the right tank combo and you communicate and you synchronize well, it's really nice to not feel like everybody's focusing you down all the time. That's great feedback to hear. Now for the DPS players, some of them said that Genji Tracer felt very good. Some of the more mobility options, because you could set up a little bit easier than some of the hit scan characters, felt great. Flexible positioning, and you could actually have decent impact on tank trades. They said that poke heroes felt tough, and it felt sometimes hard to take angles with some DPS. It could be even hard to get support on these angles because your supports were generally more tied up supporting the tank trade. Chokes didn't feel quite as bad as expected was the general take. For support players, building certain support ults a lot faster was interesting, but you did have to play a little bit more conservative. We'll talk more about that one later. They said there was a lot less room for solo play, and there was a lot more healing, but it was still fun to play.
Okay, I remember seeing this. I'm not saying this is my take. I'm saying this. I'm going to regurgitate something I read. I remember when Overwatch 2 launched, there was a lot of people that didn't like the style of support because they just like to heal. And that's it. They just like to heal. They like to heal their tanks. They like to heal the people in front of them. They don't want to sit there, and they don't want to, they don't want to have to be playing pseudo DPS simulator. They actually liked support because it was about healing and actually doing healing. Yeah, a little bit of fighting here and there, but rare. It wasn't like a lot. Like a little bit of poke, at the beginning of a fight, a little bit of poke if there's nothing to do. But it wasn't like you got to earn a kill or two to really make sure you're winning at the same time, right? Like there is no Kiri go on the flank, try to 1v1 their DPS, right? Wasn't a thing. A lot of people that wanted that style. And they liked that style because Overwatch was that. Then there was a conflicting counterpoint where it was like, you support players just want to turn your brain off and turn and just heal and do nothing else. Much granted. Hey, that's not even that wrong. It's a little insulting, but it's not wrong. It's like you're now being forced to do more and actually interact with the lobby other than just stand there and heal, right? I get that. But neither of them are wrong, I don't think. I think some people like to play support because they like to heal. But also, the style of Overwatch 2 support is much more active. It's much more going in and doing damage. And it's the whole movement of support, not healer, right? Remember that? And so I think there is something to be said about both, but I'm not even surprised in the slightest that they have to play more conservatively because you're going to get punished if you play super aggressive because supports always were the main target. You would be the one who would get shot at first because you were the one keeping everybody alive. You were the sustain, but with 2 supports on 1 tank, if you lose a support sort of early, you can get away with it. If you lost a support early in Overwatch 1, you typically lost the fight, period, point blank. So you were the difference between winning and losing a lot of games and a lot of fights by your own positioning, not even just by your mechanical skill, but your positioning, which is more brain. So Overwatch being the boomer game, especially, it rewarded you for having good positioning and being knowledgeable about matchups and having good awareness, even if you didn't have the highest mechanical skill.
One of the questions brought up by one of the support players has said, is there less room for OTPs because there's less playstyle flexibility in 6v6? Now you might, before you say, oh, playstyle, you can poke.
I'd argue there's more. I'd say there's more OTPs in Overwatch 1 than there was in Overwatch 2.
Tank DPS support, we're talking specifically about positioning, because one of the challenges of having more congested chokes is that more of those chokes congested means there's fewer positioning options for an unorthodox people.
No,
depending on the
tell
choke.
me this. How often do you see people complain about these days? Like Genji one trick, Mercy one trick, Sim one trick, Ryan one trick, Cass one trick. Like, no, like everyone flexes. Like, it's very rare to bump into one tricks. OTP is one trick pony. OTP means one trick pony.
You might need a certain couple of different DPS characters or support characters to break that choke. If you pick the wrong one, you may not have the space
Lucio one
to
trick.
function with that
Sure.
character in that situation. Something worth considering. Now let's share my study notes. So I spent the last day studying from overheads over many of the high elo games that we talked about, and not just playing the game, but actually strategizing and taking notes on exactly what could have been done, what felt good, what felt bad. Couple notes here. Number one, staggering was a bit worse in 66 because there's just more people to mess it up. It's interesting to see how this changes with the wave spawns that they're currently testing in Overwatch right now. Number two, distance is key for living tank combos / dives as a support or DPS. Proximity is very, very risky because in Overwatch 2 and 5v5, generally you can take a closer angle as long as it's away from the tank. In 66, there's now twice as many tanks, even though they're a little bit squishier, so you actually need to create a little bit of distance between yourself and the enemy tank, and do so consistently because there really isn't any good close angle. I found myself dying a lot more often as a support or DPS, when not necessarily when I was just taking angles into the enemy tank, that's dumb, but a bubbled Winston, a bubbled Zarya, a matrixed Winston, a bubbled Ryan, even something like a double dive tank where diving on top of me, that was a lot harder to avoid through taking angles. You just had to do more stuff, more work through distance management.
That's really interesting. Makes sense though.
Coaching, which a lot of time if you're playing support and DPS was about kind of playing a long distance, playing a corner, trying to keep a long distance between yourself and the tank
what we were just talking about.
Tank combo that was inevitably coming in. Something to point out. However, after those tanks do commit those cooldowns, they are a lot more vulnerable than they are in Overwatch 2. Moving on from here, tanks must clear and hold space on angles. It is your responsibility to create clear space, not just to group up and choke, but also to contest other chokes. DPS and supports cannot consistently do it on their own in most spots, especially if there's an enemy tank there. Angles still matter in 66, just as much as they did in 5v5, but you're a lot more reliant on your tanks to actually control those chokes and angles than you were in Overwatch 2, where there's a little bit more individual autonomy.
That just scratched a little part of my brain. I can't lie to you. It's just scratched a little part of my brain. Hearing that sentence, those couple sentences of tanks must control space and like take angles away. Because like you don't really do that anymore. Like, yeah, you do, right? But like, not really, because you can't be everywhere at once, right? Like, there's typically 2 or 3 angles that you can go for, right? And it's like, you can take one of them, but you can't take the other 2. But if I held mine, the other tank holds the other, that leaves 1, right? And it's like, that last one typically isn't the greatest angle. I don't know. It like low key made me happy.
There's some interesting dynamics that kind of revolve around this, where is it better to support my tank on main or defend clear an angle that's wide open? It becomes more of a priority to support maybe the tanks on main because there's now 2 of them that you have to support as a healer, but it's a much more of a resource commitment requirement, and then you might leave yourself vulnerable to an angle. It's a tricky balance. Finally, the last thing here, and this is really important, is when you don't have space in 66, hero pick matters a lot more. We talked about this earlier. There's going to be a lot of chokes, a lot of positions. Maybe they don't have verticality. Maybe they do have verticality. Maybe they have flanks. Maybe they don't have flanks. Maybe it's close. Maybe it's long. You need to pick the right DPS or the support for the situation, because taking space with every DPS and with every support character is just not as possible in the 66 format. It's a funny callback to the rock, paper, scissors problems that 5v5 has. 5v5 has the tank rock, paper, scissors, where counterpicking the enemy tank, especially as the tank, can feel more valuable than it has a right to be. And 66, counterpicking the space, counterpicking the map is actually very, very important. Final
map-based meta. That's something I haven't thought of in a long time.
Because I frankly haven't played the official attempt at 66, and nobody has. But I will say this. I did have a lot of fun, and there's a lot of potential for this game mode, especially with appropriate adjustments to hero design and considerations for some of 66 downsides. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but first, seriously, I encourage you to test these things first, not only to give you a better perspective on exactly the feedback of things, but also because it's just a lot of fun. I'll drop my code in the comments, which is the one that's post-Season 9, but you can also have your own matchmaker one that's pre-Season 9, and you don't even need to do anything. Just join the Discord and you're ready to roll. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let's see what happens in the future.
Okay, so here's the deal. The problem with all of this is it still ignores the elephant in the room, the biggest elephant in the room. the queue times. The queue times is the biggest thing, bar none. Bigger than anything else. You can have the greatest game on the planet. You can't get a game. People will stop playing. What happens? Emong actually is a great example right now. I was playing the other day, and he was kind of telling me like, okay, he didn't say it, but I'm inferring a little bit. It kind of sounded like people kept bitching at him for not playing tank because he's like top 20 like SR wise in tank. So his queues are 15, 20 minute long tank queues, right? Because he's playing in the morning when all the degenerate gamers play at night. So he's playing in the morning when not that many people are on, like higher level players, and then playing tank, like, and at high elo, like you just don't get the goddamn game. So like you just don't play. So he's flex queuing, right? Same thing will happen though in most ranks, or at least most of the high ranks, and then as you scale down through the DPS for sure, where it's like, if you have 10-minute queue times, most players are not going to sit there for 10 minutes. Like, they're going to go play something else, right? As great as it is, as great as it could be, as great as the potential skill, fun ceiling is, that is the number one thing, and we can't ignore it. So we'll see what the play tests, obviously, but like, I wonder if we'll even get a taste of it in the play tests and a taste of how long the queue times could be. I just sit and play on my Switch during the 10-minute queues, but like, that's because you were committed and you liked playing Overwatch a lot, and you were like, all right, I'll deal with the queues because I know that. How many players, though, by the end of Overwatch's lifespan, really were okay with sitting there and doing something else in queue for 10 minutes waiting? You know? Especially if you're an older gamer and you only get 2-3 hours a night at most to play. You know what I mean? Like, you only get, like, what, 5 games in? You know, even less, probably. But isn't bad game design aka 5v5? Well, that's not... You're speaking as if that's fact. That's not fact. Opinion. Like, saying 5v5 is bad game design is opinion. Like, you can say... You could say 5v5 is worse than 6v6, and I think people would agree with you. You know? I might even agree. I'm not saying I do, but I'm saying, like, you can agree with that. But again, that's opinion. It's not fact. And, like, Overwatch is growing. Like, the game has actually been slowly but surely becoming better over the last couple of years. And if you're talking, like, post-launch Overwatch 2, maybe not, but, like, after the original hype of Overwatch 2 dies, and then the PV debacle, that was the low point. Ever since then, it, like, the data shows, or at least the public data, I'm not saying it's perfect, right, shows that the game has been improving. You know, people are playing it. This season, I think, is a little bit drier than the last few seasons, and I could think that if we actually end up at the end of the season having data to look at, or Steam charts, or Twitch data, or YouTube, or TikTok metrics, or anything like that, it would probably reflect that as well. But when there's content, people like the game. They want to play it. I'm not saying either way is correct. Like, is 5v5 better or is 6v6 better? I think one can put I think gameplay preferences depends on what role you're playing, but queue times is the number one by far. I am excited though. I'm actually very much looking forward to it. I'm actually very, very, very excited. So